Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. I think people are starting to join. I'm going to try to uh, tweet out a link if we get one through so those know about it on Twitter. But bear with us, we're going to start at 5 o'clock, inshallah. Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi sallam. Alhamdulillah. We're back again with our session on exploring Allah's beautiful names in the Quran. And just before we begin, I need to read out a few announcements from the college. And just to tell you about CMC's work, um, we're an independent institute of higher education based in the UK in the beautiful city of Cambridge. We're also a registered charity. The growth and success of Cambridge Muslim College does rely on the generosity of our friends, patrons, and supporters from across the UK and beyond. So please reach out and help us to train future generations of Muslim scholars, thinkers, and leaders, and continue developing and delivering educational programs like Ramadan Live. You can help to continue our vital work through regular giving. Become a friend or patron of the college today with one-off donations, whatever the amount, or even pay zakah, which will directly benefit students in need. We have a lot of students; they're a lovely bunch. We want to have more, and helping them is helps helping us helps us to help them. Yes, please do give as you can in Ramadan. So last time in my sessions, I was talking about Allah's beautiful names. And I gave a particular framework for talking about the names, which is a theological framework. And when you have a theological framework, then you need a theological approach. And so I introduced the one of a great Imam of the Ahl-Sunnah wal Jama'ah and of the Muslims in general, Abu Mansur Al Maturidi, um, a 4th century Hijra, 10th century Gregorian scholar and exegete. And one of the unique things about Al Maturidi is that he doesn't just provide a theological take on various aspects of religion, but he also brings that theology into his Quranic exegesis. So if you read his work on the Quran, in Arabic, and it's not been translated into English yet, um, but when I do read this text, or when someone who reads Arabic reads this text, you will find these really interesting theological reflections on the Quranic verses. And he was one of the early figures to do this. Of course, others did it after him. One of the very famous scholars in this regard is Fakhruddin al-Razi. But Imam Al Matrudi was early, and he brought a unique flavor, a unique approach to the exegesis of the Quran through his theology. And so I talked about names, and I said with Al Maturidi and his idea of the divine names, the names are not something that are kind of out sort of unknown and strange. They're our ability to either our ability to name God, or they refer to something about him, which is either his attributes or just him in his own self. You know, God as the entity that is God, or in his attributes that he does possess. So this is the approach taken by Imam Maturidi. And then as discussed last time as well, different names, um, starting with Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, and also mentioned Al-Latif and Al-Barr. And so today I want to talk with about three more names, and we're not going to try to cover every name over the 4 weeks, but I want to talk about the name Al-Alim, the omniscient or the all-knowing, Al-Hakim, the wise, and also As-Sami', the all-seeing, and we can also pair this with al basir, the all sorry, the all hearing is Al-Sami', and Al-Basir, the all seeing. So we have these names. These are related, as you can see, to kind of questions of knowledge. What does God know? Knowledge and wisdom, seeing and hearing. So this is an interesting idea. How does how is it that God can hear us? And in Ramadan, we're thinking about this a bit more, maybe. How can God, and how is it that God hears us, and and knows what we want, and also obviously responds to it. So talking now on the framework of our approach, which is this approach of theological tafsir, I want to just think about the name Al-Alim. So again, Al-Alim, the attribute involved here is, of course, ilm, knowledge. So God has knowledge. So God is omniscient. God knows everything. Now, Maturidi doesn't, in his tafsir, go into too much detail on the nature of God being the omniscient, the all-knowing. And actually, that's similar as well to his theological manual. And I think that's generally a pattern here. It's taken to be such an obvious kind of attribute of God that often scholars didn't go into too much detail into it. Some of them did at various periods, and I'm not saying it's not there, but it's often just taken almost for granted that God knows everything. What does he know? Well, he knows everything that can be known. He knows all ma'lumat, right? All the knowledge, all the information, everything that can be known, God knows it. Whether that's something that exists or doesn't exist, whether that's something that's possible or impossible, God knows it all. If it can be known, if knowledge can apply to it, then God knows it without exception, without restriction. But in the tafsir, you do get some kind of expressions when this term comes up, Aleem. You get the idea that nothing is hidden from God. So there's this idea that you can't hide anything you're doing from God. Yeah, you can't have some sort of secret that you're going to keep. And also this idea that God knows both the inward and the outward of all things. So God knows what everything in the world is, all the features of the world, but God also knows the inner world. He knows about the secret thoughts, the desires, the feelings, every kind of conscious state you have, God knows that too. So nothing is hidden from him in that sense as well. So this is the main approach taken to Al-Alim. And then what will happen in the course of the tafsir is that depending on what the verse is about, then that is clarified that God knows that too. So when you're reading the Quran and you see at the end of a certain passage that Allah is Al-Alim or Alimun, then it's Allah is highlighting for us that he knows that he's aware of that he's not that's not escaping him. So it's highlighting that at all times, in all places, in all ways, God is knowledgeable over all things. And in our own selves, we need to try to bear that in mind as well, and just think about Allah knows what I'm doing, so I better behave myself. I better do what I'm meant to be doing. And especially in Ramadan, when you're fasting, there's meant to be even more of an awareness that the fast, of course, is something that, and I'm sure maybe others in the Ramadan live have covered this, that the feature of the fast is, of course, that one, could sneakily break it and people would not know, but Allah knows, and that's the point. So it's a type of worship that's very, in a way, hidden from people, because the reality of the fast, it's happening for hour after hour continuously. It's not just something that can be visibly seen by others, but Allah, of course, knows. So then what you see in the Quran is then the name Alim then gets combined with some other names. So you get Aziz al-Alim, or you get Sami al-Alim, or Alim al-Hakim, and so on, various combinations. I'm going to cover the ones that combine the name Alim with other names that relate to this kind of ideas of knowledge and knowing, with my main focus on the idea of hikmah or wisdom is going to be my main focus going forward. So, but first, talking about As-Sami al-Alim, you have this pairing quite a few times in the Quran. And it seems that As-Sami al-Alim is paired like much more, or than compared to like Al-Basir al-Alim or something like that. That doesn't come up. either as much or even at all. I couldn't find it looking quickly. But Sami Alim does come up. And so this is interesting because, God is emphasizing two things. One, his hearing. And according to Imam Al Matrudi and the Sunnis, one of God's attributes is hearing. God hears. This is deemed appropriate to apply to God because he tells us in the Quran that he hears. He also sees, but we don't hear. For example, we don't get an explicit statement in the divine names. Oh, that God smells or touches. That's not deemed appropriate. But hearing and seeing are considered to be these kind of elevated qualities that give a particular knowledge, we could say, but they're distinguished as not just identified with knowledge, at least in this theological tradition. So how does Maturidi deal with those kind of verses in his tafsir? Well, he says things like when you have like someone speaking out and making the dua, and then Allah says at the end of the dua, As-Sami Aleem, then Allah says that the portion spoken of the dua itself is Allah is Sami' over that. Allah hears that dua. So when you make a prayer and you raise your voice and make your dua out loud, then that's something that Allah, as Sami', as the all hearing, he hears it. But when it comes to something, maybe a private prayer or something that you're just a desire or something even unvocalized, even something you're almost unaware of, maybe, or only slightly, but whatever your heart yearns for or what's just left unsaid, then that is what Allah is knowledgeable about as well. So he's Al-Alim. So you've got these different dimensions. So again, of course, Allah is knowledgeable over both. So in a way, we could say ilm is a more encompassing attribute. The hearing is restricted to audible things in a sense. But by emphasizing it, God is what we know about God and how he's revealed to himself in the Quran is he is a God who listens. He is God who hears us. It's not just, if you could say, a kind of abstract accounting of knowledge, right? It's not mere process of knowledge or information. Allah really hears us. He hears our voices. He hears our cry, the tone, right? So there's something important about that's how God is in a reality. And of course, we're limited in the exact amount of that reality we can comprehend as finite beings, but also we can appreciate. Another aspect of God hearing is, of course, God speaks. And as God speaks, then, of course, God hears himself. Now, this is not to say in the Sunni dominant Sunni theologies that God speaks with a voice per se, but he does speak, and it is speech, and therefore speech is something that by its nature can be heard, right? So God can hear his own speech, and this I think is part of the reason why, one of the subtle reasons I feel that this insistence on these attributes is made contra to the Mu'tazila who rejected this, that God, because God speaks, then God, and we know God speaks. The Quran is Kalamullah. Then God in his speech, as in his own nature of his own speech, he can hear that. And then what about now turning to Basir? Well, God is also the all-seeing. So God sees everything as well. And of course, sight is our kind of, in a way, our primary sense as human beings in the world. We look out in the world. What does a baby do when a baby sort of wakes up? Baby opens its eyes and sees its parents, sees the world, perhaps. Of course, not to say that someone who lacks seeing doesn't have a rich experience. Maybe other senses can come in and try to take the place. But of course, sight is acknowledged as a major, important sense of the human beings. And we have so many metaphors that relate to vision. I see what you mean. Point of view. I take your point of view. So many of our sort of verbal metaphors and idioms relate to this idea of seeing. So God is al-Basir. God sees everything. God sees everything that there is to see. And of course, God doesn't see it from a created angle, but God encompasses everything that can be seen from any created angle, if you understand what I'm saying. Because a sight, anything we see has to be visible in some way. And so, there's not a sort of type of sight that God's ignorant of, that particular angle or vision. But of course, God transcends all of that and doesn't is not limited by that in the way that we are. But when you come to this idea of basir, God is all seeing. Then you get this idea. Well, why? Well, how does this connect with this idea of samia? Well, I'm going to suggest, and this is maybe going beyond strictly what we find in the text of Al Matrudi, as far as I'm aware, but the fact that God is himself, and this is actually relates to us later. Imam mentions this though, Bazdui. Um, God can be seen on the day of judgment. We will see God, the beatific vision, the ru'ya, bil absar. Human beings will see God. The believers in paradise is the greatest reward. So again, if we're going to be able to see God, well, it stands to reason that God will be able to see himself and can see himself, and he's not unable to see himself. So although it's impossible for us to conceive of this with our minds, we can understand this the rationale there, that God as one who speaks and one who can be seen is one who hears and can see himself, and of course everything else. So this is hopefully something to think about and reflect on. And then of course, in relation to that, we have this very famous verse of the Quran, "Laysa kamithlihi shay wa huwa as-sami'ul basir," that there is none like God, none is like unto him. Yet he is the all-hearing, the all-seeing. So no one is like God. No, and God is like no one. God is not similar. He doesn't resemble. He does, any kind of these. When we use these attribute names, we use things like knowledge and sight and hearing. We must negate a likeness to those terms from the created world, but we allow them to apply to God by analogy. We understand there's some analogy that makes it possible for us to understand something about God. Because otherwise, what's the point of revealing a scripture with language that can't refer at all? But yet God has revealed the Quran. And Maturidi actually says this. He says in his theological work, if there was some other word we could use to understand God, we would use that other word. But we can't, because we're human beings with human language, effectively. So he says, so we use the word that we can, and we understand the limitations, but we still know this does tell us something about God. We don't negate these features, these attributes, because to do that, that's not who God's told us he is. So this is, I was thinking today, Maturidi is a master of balancing the rational and the scriptural, the reason and revelation. How can you bring them together? And he does this in a masterful way. He says we must be able to understand through language, because language is how God has spoken to us, human language. But we need to be careful. So we then, at the end of that, we negate a similarity. So this is why you have the Laysa kamithlihi shay paired with Samir Basir, which I've said, these are some of the attributes that you wouldn't know about. The scholars say we wouldn't know about God is seeing and hearing unless he tells us. We wouldn't just be able to guess that. It's not something rationally guessable. It's something that we have to know because God's told us this is the reality. And so we have to reconcile that. And the way to reconcile that is through this kind of theological process. So hopefully that's useful. So now in the remaining time, I want to turn to, of course, as goes without saying, God sees everything we do. But I want to turn to the idea of Al-Hakim. And Al-Hakim is related to God's wisdom. And this is one of the most important attributes mentioned in the Quran, and also central to the theological viewpoint of Al Matrudi. It's what really distinguishes him from almost any other theologian. There's a few that also use this term, but no one used it as sort of extensively, I think, as him, and made it so central to their theological platform. And of course, this gets paired with Al-Alim as well. So you have, of course, the angels saying early on in Al-Baqarah to Allah, "Glory be to you. We have no knowledge except what you taught us. Truly, you are Al-Alim Al-Hakim, the wise, the all-knowing and the all-wise." So Maturidi, I was going through in his tafsir, when he uses this term Al-Hakim, and he uses it in so many different contexts. It's fascinating. So I'm going to take you through some of the meanings that when he's talking about Al-Hakim, and there's always a connection in the way he's using it, though. Um, so he uses it to say that God puts everything in its correct place. So wisdom, and this is also mentioned in his theological manual, it's about putting things in their correct place, putting things where they ought to go. So there's something of like harmony or balance. This wisdom is about the way that God knows how to do things, right? So it's when you have something like hearing and seeing and even knowledge, in a way, those things are kind of passive. You know things that are out there to be known, right? You possibilities that could be there. Every possibility. You see what's been created or what's been there, what's out there in the world. But with wisdom, there's something more intentional here. There's something about what ought to be, what's right, what's correct, what's not right is determined here. So this is really important because it's the sense of it's like this intrinsic, if we could say, I mean, I don't want to use a sort of the wrong word, but the sort of intrinsic normativity of God. What ought to be, not based on any other consideration of a created entity, not based on any rules that are applied from outside, but what ought to be based on how God in essentially is, this essential wisdom of how things, what is right, right? What is right? Um, Hume famously spoke about this gap between is and ought, that you can't turn an is into an ought. This idea that you describe the world, it's all things that are, but where do you get to what ought to be, what should be? Well, what Maturidi is saying is God already in who he is, there is an ought there. And that explains so much about, what how the world is and how it must be. So this is a really powerful idea, and it's what gives a lot of the weight to kind of the Maturidi theological positions on things. So that's one thing, is putting everything in its correct place. So there's no correct place outside the wisdom itself. The correct place is just um, purely God's own wisdom. That's deciding what's correct here. Secondly, God makes no mistake in his governance. So God, it's not that it's sometimes, oh, that was an accident. Oh, we have mistakes. I tried to do it right, but I messed up and I'm not streaming and I was meant to be, or I dropped the call, or in our lives forgot to get the onions. We can't make iftar. These are the things that strike us in the worldly life. God makes no mistake in how he's running things. Third, it can mean he makes every creation bear witness to his oneness and his governance of it. So his wisdom is in every single thing, bears witness to the fact that he's governor over it. And then in that as well, Maturidi talks about there being these contrariness to things. Things have these different aspects, these opposed aspects. There's these binaries and hot and cold, up and down. Things he thinks are formed of these kind of contrary natures, differences that we have in the world, disharmonies in the world. But yet there's one who, despite all of the kind of change and dynamism in the world, is the one governing all of it. And this is all of it pointing to God in his divinity and the sign of his oneness. So he says that God, in placing everything, all contrary things in their right place, he actually shows a mark of his divinity, that this is God that's done this, and a sign of his oneness, that is there's one entity behind the whole world. There's one entity who's doing everything, making it all happen. And then also it can mean knowing the reality of things, so the hakika, reality. So God knows the sort of deeper reality of things. What are things for? How do they work? It's only someone who's wise can put things together in that way. If you see the world, it's not a arbitrary world. It's not a world in which suddenly, I turn into a block of cheese. That's not going to happen. And we know it's not going to happen. Why? Because that would be foolish. We know instead that I'm going to, be able to at least remain a human being, whatever happens to me. And hopefully I can finish out this session with you. But these kind of arbitrary random things don't happen. Now, of course, he does have a take on miracles, and it's not the place today to get into the details of his theological platform in every respect. But he doesn't think that the world is unintelligible. So even things like miracles, they're going to be intelligible. They're going to have meaning. There's going to be a reason why. The miracle doesn't happen at an odd moment when the messenger's just relaxing. It happens when he's challenged. Okay, so this is important. And then also, in just going on with these meanings of wisdom of being Al-Hakim, there's this idea of judging with justice in every judgment. Um, and this is an important one as well. So God always judges with justice. There's never a possibility that God can do injustice. And this isn't because, well, justice is just whatever God decides. It's because, no, there is a right and wrong, according to Maturidi. There is a justice. There is a possibility of justice or injustice. It's just that God, it's inconceivable he would be unjust, right? These famous examples, of the innocent person, who believed in God and, did good. And then, is God going to punish them in hellfire forever? It's inconceivable. Because God is just, and that's not what God will do. Why? Because he's wise. This is Maturidi's platform, and it's a strong position theologically. He also talks about hitting the mark, which is another way of saying, putting things in its place, hitting the mark, getting it right. And finally, the opposite of foolishness, that God is not foolish. This is the same. He's not unjust. He puts three things together often. He says, God tells the truth, he does not lie. God is just, he is not unjust. God is wise, he's not foolish. And these three things come together. And I think at the heart of them is this attribute of hikmah. So what does Hakim relate to? It relates to God having hikmah. And this is something that Al-Maturidi really stresses in his theological work. And so finally, in terms of my main kind of comments today, I want to just talk about verse 27:6, which mentions you have received the Qur'an from the presence of one wise, knowing. And again, this is Hakim Aleem, not just Hakim Aleem. So, well, what does this refer to? So he gives two opinions, Maturidi, on this. He says, number one, and you, of course, is referring to the Prophet. Muhammad SAW. So the first is received the Quran from God at the hands of Jibreel. So yes, through Jibreel, but ultimately the one who's wise and knowing, this is God. But he also says in this context, it's permissible that the wise and knowing one in this verse is Jibreel, because he places the revelation and the Quran where he is commanded, i.e., to the messenger. Right, so he gives the revelation to the messenger. And so this idea of putting things in their right place, well, he's saying, well, if Hakim means putting things in their right place, well, Jibreel came and put the Quran exactly where it's meant to go, which is to the Rasul Sallallahu, to the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu. But then Maturidi at the end of that says, but the first opinion is better. So the first opinion, which is the opinion that this actually refers to God, but still he's using Jibreel for the revelation, is actually the better opinion of the two. But it's interesting that he does accept the possibility of someone of the creation being Aleem Hakim, not to the extent of God and not in the sense of God's eternal, timeless attributes and necessary attributes, but in a secondary contingent way, he does accept it, but yet he still prefers it to be referring to God in this context as well, but with Jibreel as the means. And so we're going to close the regular part of the talk there. I hope you found that beneficial. It was beneficial as a reminder for me to speak about these things in front of you all. Now, I would invite you for any questions. I'll do my best to answer them, inshallah. I'll go from there. Yeah, so I am referring, I've been asked to share the name of the book you're referring to and the author and explain more about him. Yes, so this is some of that was covered last time, so I did a bit of a recap, but I didn't sort of um, say everything again. This was something you can also go back onto the YouTube page and check out the first session, which will hopefully put some of this into context. But the author is the great theologian of Samarkand, Abu Mansur Al Maturidi, who died in the year 333, easy to remember, Hijri, which is 944 of the Gregorian calendar. He was a scholar, a great Hanafi scholar from Samarkand. He lived his whole life in Samarkand, studied, and I think eventually taught at a madrasa there called Darul Juzjaniya. And he was a great scholar, a scholar of rational disciplines. Also, he knew the Quran very well and did a huge tafsir of the whole Quran. And I'm working mainly on in these sessions from his tafsir, which is called Ta'wilat al-Quran. It's been published in 18 volumes of Arabic. So it's a very rich, huge, magisterial work. He also has an important theological text, which is the one I've actually spent more time with studying, which is the Kitab al-Tawheed, which is one of the earliest it's the earliest large theological manual in Arabic in the Islamic tradition that we have, covering all the topics. And it's also possibly the earliest sort of Sunni theological compendium. And so this is informing a lot of the interpretations I'm taking on the tafsir as well. You need to read the two texts together most of the time. So yeah, so he's a kind of great scholar of theology. Primarily he taught fiqh as well, and he wrote some books on usul fiqh, which I unfortunately lost. So on sort of legal principles and so on. But he was more of a theoretician. Even his tafsir is very focused on these questions of theology and responding to kind of other views and presenting what he thinks is the correct theological viewpoint. So it's an important area. It's not everything, but in my sessions, it's what we're focusing on. And he's someone I've studied in depth, and I'm really writing also works connected with his legacy. So hopefully this is useful for you. And of course, the Maturidi Kalam tradition or theological tradition takes its name from Al Maturidi. The name Maturidi actually refers to a region either at the very outskirts of Samarkand or possibly a village just outside. So kind of a regional, small locality called Maturid. And so this name, though, has become spread wide as one of the sort of main Sunni. You normally get sort of Asharis or Maturidis, and these two schools of thought, which are similar in many ways. But I'm highlighting sort of some of the distinctive approaches of the Imam. Can you discuss the concept of dhikr, remembrance, and its connection to the recitation and contemplation of the beautiful names of Allah? Yeah, so these names of Allah can be sort of used in invocations and in dhikr. And I think I covered a question similar to this last time. So they can be, there are actual du'as that have been made, in the Islamic tradition, normally sort of post-prophetic as well. Like so after the time of the Prophet, people have used these names and have actually built them into special du'as or special adhkar. So you would repeat these names. You might even repeat certain combinations of the names, many times as like a sort of as a tasbih. You might recite, you might call out to the name. So you say ya Aleem, ya Hakim, ya Sami, ya Basir, etc. That's completely valid. You could recall the names. You use them in your invocations. Call on Allah by His names. So He's given us these names. One of the reasons is to call on Him. So this is important information, or important for our practice. So yeah, so my intention with these sessions is not being, because given my, I'm an academic, I'm a theologian. I'm not a kind of a murshid, sort of a guide for people's spiritual developments. I wouldn't put myself in that position. Obviously, I do my best with my own students and so on, but I don't sort of go out with a lot of practical of kind of advice on spiritual development, which some other people, members of my colleagues may specialize more in. I do apologize for that, but hopefully by just reflecting even on these kind of theological topics, I do think there's something very profound and powerful about that as well. So, do seek further guidance from those who are more knowledgeable than me on those aspects of how to use these names in the best way to get closer to Allah Most High. But certainly, Allah gives us names to call on Him, to refer to Him, and He is all hearing. So call on Him by these names. They are the most beautiful names. So inshallah, I'll start to wrap up. Jazakallah khairan for your attention. I hope you found it beneficial. Just to say one more time, CMC does need your help. Please become a friend, patron, or supporter. Go to cambridgemuslimcollege.ac.uk/donate. You can donate. You can join us in any of these capacities and help us out. We're doing lots of great work. We're doing research. We're doing training of students. We've got programs of all sorts. Come and visit the college if you get the chance as well. It's a lovely place and with lovely people. So yeah, you can help us out. But also we've got the Ramadan Live program rolls on. In the middle of the second week. We've got 4 weeks in total. So we've got on Mondays, Omar Qureshi, aiming high the objectives of the Quran. Tuesday, Salman Yunus, the spiritual dimensions of fasting and charity in the Quran. On Friday, Rania Awad, finding healing through the Quran. Saturday, Suleiman Van Al, spiritual jurisprudence in the Quran. Sunday, Abdullah Rothman, knowledge of self in the Quran. So Saturday and Sunday, possibly actually, they're Saturday and Sunday are longer sessions and I think more, as I understand it, and so maybe you can also get questions answered there that we of benefit. And then of course we have Sheikh Al-Hakim Murad on Thursdays. It's not a live session, but there's a released Ramadan moment, so you can check that out as well. So I hope you find all these sessions beneficial. I can speak that these are, almost everyone involved is a colleague that I know well, and really amazing people at the college. Really are, I feel that the scholars we have are a good testament to what we do and the approach we take. We hope it's a benefit to everyone. Keep us in your du'as, and we'll try to keep you in ours. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.